It was near the end of 2023, and my Facebook algorithm popped up a video clip of the 1999 song from South Park, "The Lonely Jew on Christmas." Kyle sang, "It's hard to be a Jew on Christmas. My friends won't let me join in any games. I can't sing Christmas songs or decorate a Christmas tree. I'm a Jew, a lonely Jew on Christmas." I remember when I first heard that song, I had a mix of emotions. I was a bit snobbily offended, thinking to myself, I'm not lonely. I was concerned about the reaction of the non-Jews who maybe didn't know that much about us. There was definitely a part of me that smiled because the song is actually very funny. But at its core, as there is with all humor, there was a kernel of truth to what it is that I was hearing. For many of us in this room, the Christian holiday season and the end of the year are indeed a bit challenging. It's a reminder that we are a minority, and a small one at that, in a much, much bigger world. Many of our friends and colleagues look at life through a different set of lenses than we do. They're not necessarily aware that this is the time when we're all together, observing the most holy and solemn days of our calendar. They're unaware that we're not decorating our Christmas tree, and when they invite us to their holiday parties with the best of intentions for inclusion, they do not realize that it's still just not ours. It is, in fact, a very lonely time to be a Jew. Also earlier this year, I had the incredible opportunity to spend some time with former Israeli Ambassador Michael Oren when he was here in San Diego for a JNF event. Debbie and I had the honor of hosting him, and in my conversation with him, he began to speak about the lonely Jew. Of course, in the context of our conversation, it had to do with the post-October 7th reality in which we are all continuing to exist. I began to think a great deal about that phrase over the next days and months. For many of us, more than any other time, this last year, 5784, has been a period of deep and profound loneliness. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this decade begun and continues to be one of the loneliest that we have known in our lifetime. It began with COVID, driving us, and especially our young adults, away from one another, away from the support and connection that was so desperately needed. Add to that the proliferation of social media, creating friendships without having to actually see each other, talk to each other, or even listen to each other. All of the above exacerbated divisions that have always been within the Jewish community. We've never been monolithic, and I would argue that we're better because of that. But somehow, we lost our ability to harmonize those disparate voices into a Jewish communal chorus. Not only are we facing being ostracized by the outside world, but now we see it in the midst of our own communities, with denominational differences in politics, our connection to Israel, our family, our friends. In the middle of 2023, our Jewish homeland seemed on the verge of chaos, with rallies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. We witnessed the epitome of everyone shouting at one another and nobody listening. And then, the world that was already teetering on its edge broke. The unimaginable became our brutal reality. 1 year ago, horrors that we believed we would never see again were on our screens and emblazoned into our memories. We stood in disbelief as we heard the testimonies of those who survived, and we waited. We waited for the world to recoil in horror. We waited for our allies to stand unequivocally with us and finally understand what we have been fighting for decades. We waited for our friends to reach out to us and even just ask, "Are you okay?" And there was silence. Not by everybody, to be sure, but that heavy, ominous silence far outweighed what we were hearing. Then, after just a few days and weeks, while we were still burying our dead and trying to figure out how it could possibly have happened, the silence began to be broken. But what we were hearing was incredible. It was even more painfully isolating than the atrocities themselves. It was their fault. They deserved it. What do you expect when you oppress a people and perpetrate a genocide? Then the attacks began on the Jews throughout the world. There were more anti-Semitic attacks done against Jewish people and Jewish communities in the past year than in multiple years that came before. And the loneliness deepened. There were even some who claimed, as they did with the Holocaust, that it never really happened. It was all fake news propagated by the evil Zionist regime. I was in Israel in November of 2023. I saw, I smelled, I witnessed what happened. So here we are a year later. Our hostages are still in the hands of a ruthless terrorist organization. We have not been able to work through the pain and the realities of what happened because we're still fighting for our existence. Israel has been under constant and consistent attack since that very day and every day since, from the south to the north and from everywhere in between. And somehow, the country that's being attacked on 7 fronts is perceived in the world as the aggressor. The loneliness continues. Loneliness is unsparing, hard, and seems to be built into the very system in which we live. In his book, The Heart of Loneliness, Rabbi Mark Katz begins by saying, "Loneliness is the principal problem of human existence. Our yearning for companionship is part of the fabric of the universe. We are not the first to feel the loneliness of being human or being a Jew. In fact, as we look at our stories, we see a great deal of loneliness. It began in the beginning. The first human being, Adam, was created alone. Yes, he had the animals to keep him company, but God realized that something wasn't right. Adam was alone, and it's not good for human beings to be alone. God created for Adam an Ezer Kenegdo, someone to share life with, someone who could support him and who he could support. This story seems to indicate that loneliness is negative, dangerous, and that it's something to be avoided at all costs. Studies have shown that lonely individuals are more likely to have suicidal ideation and to take their own lives. They have lower functioning immune systems and higher rates of heart disease. Many of us believe that the worst plague that Egypt suffered was the final one, the death of the firstborn. But the rabbis share that it was the penultimate plague, darkness, that was actually the worst. It was not just that they could not see, but the darkness was so all-encompassing that no one could interact with anyone else. They could not see, hear, speak, or even move. That isolation, that loneliness, was what made the plague so pernicious. As negative and difficult as it is, story after story demonstrates that being alone is part of who we are as human beings, and even more specifically as Jews. I imagine Noah felt very alone as he watched humanity perish with only his family by his side. Abraham was asked by God to leave everything and everyone he knew and go to a place that was undisclosed and unfamiliar. Even the way that Avraham was referred to speaks of his loneliness. He is called Avraham HaIvri, Abraham the Hebrew, Ivri. The Midrash cites Rabbi Yehuda explaining the name Ivri. Kol ha'ulam kulo mi'ever echad, vehu mi'ever echad. The entire world was on one ever, one side, and he, Avraham, was on the other ever, the other side, Ivri. But as we look at our tradition, there can be no lonelier figure than Moses. When he was selected as the one to go and lead the people, he was alone. And the reason he was there in the first place was because he, like Avraham, had to leave his home, in his case, going into exile. Although he did have his brother Aaron by his side, it was Moses that had to face Pharaoh. It was Moses that had to endure the abuse of his own people when things didn't work out well at first. It was Moses who had to call down each of the plagues, and it was he who had to go up to Mount Sinai alone to receive the commandments. He faced the demands of God and the complaints of the people, acting most often as that lone intermediary, trying to work with opposing sides and bring them together. And then, at the end of his life, because of who he was, even his death and burial were alone. No other human being was there. No one else knew where he was buried. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who literally wrote the book on loneliness in his Lonely Man of Faith, sees Moses as a paradigmatic figure for what it means to be a lonely Jew. Despite his greatness and his preeminence as an example to the Jewish people, he never achieves connection, not with family, not with friends, not even the people that he was leading. For Soloveitchik, being Jewish, being a person of faith, means being alone. It seems, however, that it's not just we who are destined to be alone. There's a strong argument to be made that God, too, feels alone. Perhaps we've all misunderstood that poignant moment in Genesis where God is looking for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden after they had eaten from the tree of knowledge. They're hiding from God, and we see God say, Ayeka, where are you? I had always heard that verse in my head with a punitive overtone, as if a parent was looking for a child knowing they had done something wrong and they're ready to offer a punishment. But maybe we should hear this verse, where are you, as a lonely cry of a God hoping to have a close connection and understanding with his creation, instead realizing it was not to be. Abraham Joshua Heschel relates a powerful story of Rabbi Baruch's grandchild who was playing hide and seek with one of his friends. He hid himself and stayed in his hiding place for a long time, assuming that his friend would look for him. Finally, he went out and saw that his friend was gone, apparently not having looked for him at all, and that his own hiding had been in vain. He ran to the study of his grandfather, crying and complaining about his friend. And upon hearing that story, Rabbi Baruch broke into tears and said, God says I hide, but there's no one to look for me. A lonely God indeed. So we are alone, and God is alone. As hard as it is, maybe there's something we're supposed to learn from our loneliness. something that cannot be learned in any other way. Once again, Soloveitchik sees the lonely man of faith as an ideal, something to which we should aspire. Our tradition does not ask us to leave behind our lives and find our way to a mountaintop or sequester ourselves in a monastery, but maybe we are expected to feel some of that solitude even when enmeshed in the world around us. Our Hasidic tradition brings forward the idea of hitbodedut. It comes from the Hebrew word badad, which means alone, and it encompasses the idea and practice of solitude as a spiritual tool. Through hitbodedut, we examine ourselves and re-examine ourselves, correcting the flaws and errors of the past while seeking the proper path of the future. It's the basis for the spiritual practice of Jewish meditation and private prayer. What's important to note, however, is that while it speaks about solitude and being away from everyone, its purpose is to actually bring us closer to God. Rav Nachman teaches, hitbodedut is the highest asset and greater than anything. That is, to set for oneself at least an hour or more for secluding oneself in some room or a field and speak one's peace with one's Maker. This prayer and conversation should be in the language one normally uses, one's native tongue. It's a practice that's accessible to all people, from the least to the greatest. Fortunate is the one, he says, who grabs a hold of it. The truth is that we all need some time alone. The incessant cacophony of stimuli in the modern world is overwhelming. If we don't take time for ourselves, if we don't find some quiet and solitude, it's easy to lose ourselves, our values, and our ability to interact effectively with the world around us. So what then is the difference between being alone, a positive, and being lonely, something that's negative? It's not about the number of people that are around you. It's very possible to feel connected to the people you love even when you're by yourself. We somehow manage to take that love and connectedness with us even when we're physically alone and know that we're not forsaken. At the same time, we also know that it's possible to feel abandoned even when surrounded by hundreds or thousands of others. That's something many of our college students have discovered this past year since October 7th. We can start understanding the difference by simply describing being alone as a physical state, while loneliness is an emotional one. In that way, we can see that they exist independently of one another. In agreement with Rav Nachman, solitude allows for personal growth, mindfulness, and a deeper understanding of oneself. It often leads to clarity and peace of mind and a sense of autonomy. It removes the extraneous distractions and allows for focus. Loneliness, on the other hand, is the emotional experience of feeling disconnected from others, even when in other people's presence. It's a subjective sense of isolation with feelings of sadness, longing, or exclusion. Chronic loneliness can lead to emotional distress. It can even create a feedback loop where the feeling of isolation makes it harder to seek connection. Being alone is a choice. Loneliness is typically unwanted and intrusive. So what can we do to diffuse the loneliness that eats away at us, to dispel the oppressive weight of the silence when we need people most? First, we must recognize that if we remain silent in our desolation, how can we ever expect others to hear us? The response to silence should not be silence. Our tradition has a history of being the loud, crying voice when everyone else seems mute. I shared on the first day of Rosh Hashanah at the sounding of the shofar, give heed to the sound of the shofar. Allow it to cry out and embody the moment and the pain that we feel. Let the sound of the shofar blasts pierce and drive away that silence. Let it be our call to God and everyone else to hear us, to state unequivocally that we will no longer be silent. It is our cry that often brings awareness and action from others. Ve'ata hinei tza'akat b'nei Yisrael ba'a elai. God says, now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Secondly, the emotion of loneliness is something that cannot be abolished when physically alone. In spite of the fact that solitude often gives us clarity and focus, we need others to help us past that feeling of loneliness. The Talmud relates the story of Rabbi Chia bar Abba who fell ill. Rabbi Yochanan came to visit him and said, do you desire to be ill and afflicted? Rabbi Chia said to him, I welcome neither this suffering nor this reward. Rabbi Yochanan said, give me your hand. At which point, Rabbi Chia bar Abba gave his hand, and Rabbi Yochanan stood him up and restored him to health. But later, Rabbi Yochanan fell ill, and Rabbi Hanina entered to visit him, and the same process occurred. And the Talmud asked the question, why did Rabbi Yochanan wait for Rabbi Hanina to restore him to health? If he was able to heal his student, why did Rabbi Yochanan not stand himself up? The Gemara answers, Ein chavush matir atzmo mi beit ha'asurim. A prisoner cannot free himself from prison. If we suffer our loneliness in solitude, we will never be free of it. We need others to help us stand and to bring us out of the depths. Now the psalmist writes, Mima amakim karaticha, from out of the depths I call. But what happens when no one hears? The truth is that we not only need to learn how better to pierce the silence by calling out, but we also need to learn how to hear another's cry. How often have we closed our hearing to the needs of those around us? Those we know share with us how they're doing, but we just move on. Sometimes it doesn't even register. Even Job's friends, who went specifically to comfort him in his suffering, wind up blaming him instead and further isolating him in his pain. To help someone, we need to listen, and we need to be willing to hear their hurt. Rabbi Katz shares a story about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. He once saw two peasants in a tavern, drunk and celebrating with one another. Arm in arm, they were proclaiming how much they love each other. Suddenly, Ivan turned to Peter. Peter, tell me, what hurts me? Bleary-eyed, Peter looked at Ivan. How do I know what hurts you? Ivan replied, disappointed, if you don't know what hurts me, how can you say you love me? My friends, we are hurting. The person sitting next to you is hurting. We come here this Yom Kippur not only to correct our shortcomings, but to love one another enough to reach out a hand and stand each other up. That is the task. That is the task of this and every Jewish community, in this coming year, that we see, hear, and feel each other, despite the attempts to isolate us. You see, that feeling of loneliness, those thoughts in the back of our head that maybe it just isn't worth it, that's exactly what those who perpetrated October 7th want us to feel. Once it happened that there was a man lost in the depths of a dark forest for many days. At long last, he saw another man approaching. "Please," he said, "show me the way out of this forest." "My friend," replied the other, "I too am lost. But I can tell you this, the way that I have come leads nowhere. Let us join hands and search for a new way together." There is no doubt that this coming year will bring challenges and tough times. Let us dedicate ourselves as a community to joining with one another and finding the path through. Adonai is our strength and our might. Ozi v'zimrat yah vayhi li lishua. 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 Av harachamim, merciful God, help us to hear not just the words we recite today, but the silences in between. To listen to the sometimes unspoken cries of loneliness, and to be the hands that reach out in love, in friendship, and in understanding. Grant us the wisdom to recognize that each of us is a vessel of your divine presence, and that by showing up for one another, we reflect your light into the darkness of isolation. May we emerge from this holy day with renewed purpose, to be there for one another, to hear one another, and to walk together in solidarity as one community and one people. Gmar Chatima Tova.